In 2002, a burning body was found in a field in Cambridgeshire. It was a man who'd been shot and stabbed multiple times.
Not many of us actually get close to a murder or a murder scene, especially one that is so horrific.
The body could not be identified. This sparked one of the most extraordinary murder cases in British criminal history.
We've got an unknown body set on fire, stabbed and shot. We don't know who he is and we don't know where he was killed.
The question was, how do you catch a killer when you don't know who they've killed?
Not knowing who the victim was fairly unique. I still think unique to this day.
When there's a murder with no suspect, no leads, perhaps not even a body, that's when investigators face their toughest test. The evidence must be gathered. The evidence must be analysed. But the evidence is worthless if you can't pin it to a suspect. The only way to crack the hardest cases of all, the only way to prove what happened, the difference between success and failure, critical evidence. On December the 21st, 2002, an off-duty fireman was cycling near Upton in Cambridgeshire. A spot known locally as Dead Man's Hollow. A strong burning smell caught his attention. As a fireman, he knew instantly what this scent was. Burning flesh. Just across the hedge from the road, a body was burning. He called the police. Bert Dean was the first senior officer on the scene.
It was just before Christmas. About 10 o'clock, I got a call in my office to say a discovery of a body burning in a corner of a field out at Upton. And straight away I knew this was probably the end of Christmas, you know. When I arrived on the scene, the police were already there. The traffic department had closed the road.
It was immediately apparent that a murder had taken place.
It appeared that a car had reversed into the lane. Then there was footmarks at the back of where the car was, and then there was drag marks in the mud. So they'd obviously taken the body out of the boot of a car and dragged it to where they'd set it on fire.
Despite the rain, the body was still burning. Vital evidence could be going up in smoke. Bert had to move fast and think on his feet.
The most important thing when you go to a murder scene is that we preserve evidence, because you can never recapture that again. We made a very quick decision that the fire service would use a fine mist spray to actually put the flames out.
A first instinct might have been to use a power hose to quickly douse the flames. The fine spray meant crucial evidence was not destroyed by a jet of water. The next challenge was the rain, which was washing away traces of what had happened.
There was a number of things round the body, so obviously we needed to get this covered with a tent as soon as possible. You completely seal off a scene and make sure that nothing is lost.
Detective Inspector Oz Marigold arrived on the scene soon after Bert. It was immediately obvious this would be no ordinary case.
It's very rare that you have a burning body in a field, for a start. You know, I've been a detective a number of years. It's the first type of murder I've been to where a body's been disposed of in that way.
Oz was exhibits officer, responsible for any evidence collected.
The role as exhibits officer at the scene is to log everything that's brought in, and which officer finds it, where it's found, and to ensure that that's secured and that it doesn't leave my control whilst at the scene.
Under the cover of the tent, the police retrieved what evidence remained. Close to the body was a cigarette lighter and the nozzle from a petrol can used to start the fire. A partially burned bin bag was next to the body. In the bag were the remains of blood-soaked paper toweling, the charred fragments of a typed letter, and packaging for a pair of surgical gloves.
It looked like it was a clean-up, really, where people had stuffed a lot of things into a bag, then taken them to this scene and set them on fire.
It had been Bert's quick thinking that meant this potentially critical evidence was preserved.
And I still think to this day, another 30 seconds, 60 seconds at most, that note would have been completely burnt.
No usable fingerprints or footprints were found, nor was any blood, which told the police this was not the murder scene. The items recovered were analysed, but none of them produced any immediate leads. DNA was found on the lighter, but it had no matches on the national database. The glove packet had a serial number, but this could not be traced. So, what becomes your critical evidence in a murder case with no leads? The answer is the same in any murder investigation: the victim. David Liddell was the Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case.
In murder investigations, you start from the identification of the victim and work outwards. What you have on that occasion was an unknown male, quite extensively burnt. We knew early on it was going to be very difficult to identify the victim.
The victim's identity and obviously their background, or their movements really within the last 24 hours before they were murdered, these are all vital to actually get to the bottom of a murder. And when you don't have that, you don't have a starting point.
The police hoped an autopsy would reveal who this man was and what had happened to him. Oz Marigold was alongside the pathologist to log any evidence.
At a post-mortem, you're certainly looking at the body from an evidential point of view. For anybody that's been around a lot of blood and gore, it's not a nice experience, but nevertheless it's an important one and one that needs to be done.
X-rays on the body revealed bullet wounds to the victim's skull. The bullets were found to be homemade, fashioned from a metal bar. These improvised projectiles had not been fatal. After being shot, he had also been stabbed several times in the torso. Wound marks to his arms showed he had fought to defend himself from his attackers. Those knife wounds were the cause of death.
This person had fought for their life. To this day, that still sticks in my mind, the violence they must have suffered. Yeah, that doesn't, police officers are all human. At the end of the day, we go home to our families, go home to our kids, and seeing something like that isn't nice. Yeah, and I can remember to this day exactly what it was like, even the smells, yeah.
The autopsy results suggested two lines of inquiry. First, this murder was unlikely to have been a one-man job.
Just to get him out of the back of a car and drag him to the scene in the field, you would probably need more than one person.
The second conclusion was that this attack had the hallmarks of a gangland killing.
The ferocity of the attack wasn't something that we were used to in Cambridgeshire itself. It did lead us to believe that we were looking at some type of organised crime group.
But the conclusion the police wanted most of all was the identity of this victim. Because without that, Bert and his team faced a jigsaw for which they did not have the first piece.
We've got an unknown body in a field, set on fire, stabbed and shot, and we don't know who he is and we don't know where he was killed.
In 2002, in Dead Man's Hollow, Cambridgeshire, a murdered man's body was found burning. With no evidence leading them to a killer or a murder scene, Senior Investigating Officer Bert Dean and his team were desperate to know one thing. Who was the victim?
Identifying a victim, you quickly can find out the motive for their murder. And when you don't have that, you don't have a starting point.
The police hoped the victim's autopsy would give them the clues they needed.
We'll normally use a forensic odontologist, and they will take a mould of the victim's teeth and use their teeth to try and identify the victim. On this occasion, we weren't able to identify the victim from his teeth, from fingerprints or from DNA.
So we had to concentrate very much on finding out who he was and finding out the scene of the murder.
Every resource was now poured into the efforts to identify the body. Forensic artists made images of the man's potential appearance. Media campaigns appealed for information. And in the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded.
We looked at all surrounding forces to see if they had any unidentified scenes of crime where blood was found, where there were signs of violence, where there was a car recovered with blood in it, this type of thing.
At its height, the investigation had up to 50 detectives working on it, together with a house-to-house team.
But none of the investigators' efforts produced any breakthrough.
Normally within, the first 24 hours you find out who they are, but we didn't have that, and this went on for months like this, not knowing him.
And that's when you get the sense that this is going to be a very difficult investigation, that we're going to have to dig in and start to try and identify creative ways to try and identify who the victim is.
Bert knew his investigation badly needed a shot in the arm. It came in the form of a press report of a scientist who'd helped Lancashire police identify a body.
And as soon as I read that, we did some investigation and found out that it was actually a Dr. Black that had done the work. And I rang him up, talked to him about it. He told me what he could do for us.
Dr. Stuart Black is an expert in environmental radioactivity at Reading University. He specialises in dating ancient remains, from rock formations to skeletons. His work involves analysing isotopes, the trace remains of the various elements that build up in our bodies over time. Through this, he can understand both when and how a person lived.
Isotope analyses have been used for many decades in a number of different academic disciplines, but applying those types of methodologies to the forensic science sort of area was extremely new and novel.
Dr. Black told Bert that given the right samples from the body, his team could offer clues to the victim's past life and identity.
So in terms of the reconstruction of humans, the best thing to try and do is to try and take a series of different materials that provide snapshots for individuals at different times of their life.
The first sample Dr. Black requested from the body was a tooth. Analysing the lead isotopes it contained could give Dr. Black clues to the man's early life.
Lead isotopes are accumulated through environmental pollution, so we accumulate these materials all the time. We're breathing particles in the air. So between about the ages of 12 to 14, you've established most of your tooth enamel, and that snapshot that we then get is up to that age.
The lead isotopes in the tooth convinced Dr. Black that the victim had been born and raised somewhere in Eastern Europe. This was the investigators' first hint as to where their victim was from. The second sample Dr. Black requested was part of the victim's femur. Unlike teeth, bone continues to change every 6 to 7 years, offering Dr. Black a window into the last few years of the victim's life. Analysis revealed isotopes in the victim's bone that could only have come from one place on Earth: Sizewell Nuclear Plant in Suffolk.
Each nuclear power station has a different sort of process of working, and therefore there's a slightly different isotopic fingerprint to materials that are discharged from that area. And so that led me to believe that individual was associated certainly with that area in and around Sizewell or Eastern England.
These results suggested the victim had moved within a radius of Sizewell between 3 and 6 years ago.
When I presented this information to the police, I'm not quite sure that they really believed me initially, but it seemed quite odd that this academic was coming up with these very bizarre scenarios of an individual who's from Eastern Europe and in the UK, and then the expressions on their faces were quite interesting initially.
So the police now had their first intelligence on the victim's identity. He was Eastern European in origin and had likely come to live in the east of England in recent years. Now that's useful information, although it's hardly a name and address for the dead man. But intelligence gains its real power when it's applied to the critical evidence. And Dr. Black's findings were about to transform this investigation when Bert connected them to one of the items recovered from the field: the burnt fragments of the letter found by the victim's body. Chemical analysis of these fragments had revealed a residue of blood splatter on them.
Although we couldn't get DNA from it because of what they'd gone through, we knew that they'd actually, if they had a fine mist of blood on, it meant that they were most likely from the scene of the murder where violence had taken place, and that's how the blood would have got on them.
The police had painstakingly pieced the fragments together to recreate what appeared to be a memo about a medical appointment.
There weren't complete full names, but you could see that they were Talbot and most likely Armstrong. You're thinking, is the victim's name Talbot or is the offender's name Talbot?
Bert's team wrote to every Talbot and Armstrong in Cambridgeshire in the hope someone would recognise the memo. But no positive replies came back. Now Bert was faced with the impossibility of contacting all the Talbots and Armstrongs within a practically limitless area.
This body could have come miles. It's near the A1 corridor, so somebody could have come out of London, really, or from Lincoln. You know, you can be down those areas within 45, 50 minutes. You know, you can come a long way.
But what Dr. Black's findings allowed Bert to do was to narrow down the area of their inquiry.
I made a policy decision that we would find out the names of Talbots and Armstrongs in all the areas that Dr. Black had talked about. So he talked about this area running from Lincolnshire right down Norfolk, Suffolk, and across, I think, towards Oxford and the south coast.
Armed with Dr. Black's analysis, Bert decided to write a letter to every person named Talbot or Armstrong in the east of England. All 2,099 of them. What Bert was doing was a shot in the dark. The early 2000s was practically the golden era for junk mail. Even if the letter reached the right person, they might just chuck it out along with the envelope marked, "Look inside to see how much you've won." But not for the first time in this case. Bert was flat out of choices.
Yes, it's an unusual investigative tactic, but one I thought at the time made sense. We had literally come to a dead end, and it was one of the only real options left.
It was a roll of the dice. But against the odds, this letter would provide the crucial breakthrough Dean and his team so desperately needed.
I can see them sitting in my front room now. They said this is, the first real lead that they'd had. They were definitely very excited.
Senior investigating officer Bert Dean and his team were looking for the killer or killers who had dumped and burned their victim in a field near Peterborough. Months after the crime, and the victim's identity was still a mystery.
We had to concentrate very much on finding out who he was and finding out the scene of the murder.
Scientific analysis of the dead body suggested the victim had lived in the east of England. The investigators' critical evidence was the remains of a medical memo found by the corpse. 2 names were legible: Talbot and Armstrong. Bert decided to write to everyone with these surnames in the area suggested by the body analysis. He knew this was a gamble.
Whenever you write to somebody, it's a hit and miss thing as to whether they'll chuck that in the bin, whether they'll pick it up and read it, and whether they see it's from the police, and if they're hostile, probably wouldn't even consider replying to it.
The mail shot brought in a slew of replies, none of them helpful.
It's like fishing, waiting for that float, waiting for something to take the bait. It can be frustrating.
But in September 2003, almost a year after the body was discovered, a lady called Vanessa Armstrong was preparing to leave home.
I was getting ready to actually go to Norwich, and there on the mat was a brown envelope. When I picked it up and turned it over, it had Cambridgeshire County Constabulary on the back, and I thought it was a speeding ticket. I thought, rats. Opened it up, looked at it, and there it said, "Dear Ms Armstrong, murder investigation." I thought, what on earth do I know about a murder? And I just tossed it onto a table by the front door. And as it fell, something fell out of it. And it was a very colourful sort of sheet. I bent down and picked it up, and when I looked at it, there was my writing on it. And then I read the letter accompanying it. Yes, it was a shock. So I rang the number.
I recall vividly lunchtime on the 5th of September 2003, when I'd physically been involved in the investigation at that point for 9 months, day in, day out. Vanessa Armstrong rang to explain she had written the letter to an employee named Paul Talbot. That was the most powerful part of the investigation. To receive that phone call from Vanessa Armstrong was a fantastic experience, and I can still remember where I was to this very day.
The police wasted no time in interviewing Vanessa.
And they said, right, where are you? So I told them where I lived. They said, can we come over now? I said, well, actually, no, I've got to go to Norwich to pick my son up. I said, I'll be back about 4:30. And when I got home, they were already there.
Vanessa worked as a human resources assistant at a ball bearing factory in King's Lynn, 30 miles east of Peterborough. Part of her role involved organising medicals for the factory staff.
I explained to the police that these were routine medical appointments carried out on a yearly basis. My job was to send out these letters. I can see them sitting in my front room now. They said this is, the first real lead that they'd had. They were definitely very excited.
Microscopic blood splatter on the letter told police it had been present when their victim had been stabbed. If they could trace the memo's movements, it could take them to the murder scene. Bert and Oz went with Vanessa to the factory.
So we went to Vanessa's office and we saw where she typed that up. And we said, well, where would it go to then? And they said it'd go to a pigeonhole with Talbot's name on. Then Talbot would pick it up and he would keep it until he went for his appointment on the 18th. So it turned out he had gone 2 days prior to the murder to the medical room.
Oz and Bert asked the factory managers to show them to the medical room. They were now on high alert.
We were acutely aware that we could be rushing past the murder in the corridor. So as we walked down to that, the room, we were trying not to arouse too much suspicion amongst the staff there, because we didn't know whether the murderer was amongst one of them.
The factory manager explained that the medical nurse would have taken the memo from Talbot upon his arrival.
After the nurse had finished, she would invariably tear the letter into sort of 4 or even 8 pieces and drop it into the bin in the first aid room.
He said it probably went in that bin there. So I'm thinking of the bin, the fact that a bag load of items had been burnt at the scene, so was this a clean-up? So I'm beginning to think we've got something here. This could be the actual scene of the murder.
Bert and Oz were now walking a tightrope. They needed to search the room for evidence to confirm it was the murder scene without alerting any potential suspects. And what do the police always do in situations like these? They form an old-fashioned double act. Bert kept the factory manager diverted, chatting, while Oz searched the room.
I asked if I could have a look in some of the cupboards, because I knew that I knew what I was looking for. I was looking for medical gloves, surgical gloves.
As exhibits officer, Oz had been responsible for researching every detail of the physical evidence recovered from the burnt body. Amongst these had been the surgical glove packet with a printed serial number.
I'd filled out that many forms with that serial number, using that serial number, and referred to it so many times. I'd almost had the number ingrained on my mind. I'd memorised it. It was simple as that. I opened a cupboard and there were some gloves there. Took a pack out, and immediately I realised that this is the same serial number.
Bert sensed that Oz had found something significant.
He looked at me and I looked at him. That was enough. We knew we'd found something.
If I remember rightly, I think Bert was trying to calm me down, because I think I was going off the script of being discreet, because I think I was getting quite excited by the fact that we found these gloves.
But I don't want to give anything away at this stage. And I just brought the whole meeting to an end, kept it very low-key, didn't give anything away. And we left the factory, hopefully with the manager thinking, that's it, they're happy.
The gloves and the memo convinced Oz and Bert they had found the scene of the murder. 2 days later, they returned with a full forensic team and had the room sealed off. But initial examinations produced nothing incriminating.
Because the memo had fine spray of blood on it, we thought we're bound to find some on the ceiling or the walls or somewhere. We had a disappointing whole morning there, because they worked all morning and found absolutely nothing.
But then, Vanessa Armstrong made her second crucial contribution to the case.
I was asked to give several statements along the way, and one of them, I believe, was that about the furniture in the first aid room. And I remembered that I had arranged to have it moved.
So we asked one of the staff then if it could be put back to exactly how it was in December 2002. And that was significant, because quite soon then the forensic team started to find splashes of blood and traces of DNA in the tile and the grouting that had previously been masked or hidden by a cabinet that had been moved.
We had that rushed off to the lab straight away, and it came back as the victim's DNA. So we knew we'd got the scene of the murder.
The killers had covered their traces well, but not quite well enough. The police now had the critical evidence to prove the medical room was the scene of the murder. But this investigation was far from done. The police still didn't know who their murderers were or who they had murdered.
It doesn't matter if you don't know who the offenders are, you'll get them eventually if you know who the victim is. But on this occasion, we had no idea who the victim was.
Police were on the trail of the killers of a man whose body was found dumped and burned at Dead Man's Hollow, Cambridgeshire. The identity of the victim was a mystery, but fragments of a burned memo found by the body led them to a factory in King's Lynn. Blood in the factory's medical room matched that of the burned victim. Now they had the murder scene, but who was the murderer? The factory staff were DNA tested against the DNA found in the lighter by the burned body. There were no matches.
People were shocked. We all hear about things on the radio and see a lot on the television, but not many of us actually get close to a murder or a murder scene, especially one that was so horrific.
Talbot was also eliminated from the inquiry. The police started to dig through the staffing records at the factory.
We obviously concentrated on the time of the murder. The body was found on Saturday. We realised that on Friday the factory had closed about 3:30. There was a security guard took over, and he hadn't been seen after the Saturday morning.
Once we were able to get the roll call for working that evening, we were able to identify that a male named Nishan Bakuntz was the night security guard for that factory. Nishan Bakuntz had left at 6 a.m. on the Saturday morning, which was the 21st of December, the day the body was discovered. He'd mysteriously disappeared and had never gone back to work.
Records revealed Nishan Bakuntz was an Armenian who had moved to England 4 years previously. The police began searching for the critical evidence to link Bakuntz to the killing.
We started looking through the history of Nishan Bakuntz and were able to identify that he was an asylum seeker from Eastern Europe and had been given leave to stay in the country with his wife. Shortly after this, we found out that they lived in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk.
Obviously, we're not ready yet to arrest him, although he's now certainly our chief suspect for this murder. So we do put him under surveillance to find his comings and goings.
The police investigated Bakuntz's financial records.
We then did a lot more background on Bakuntz and proved that he had bought a gun, a blank-firing weapon in Great Yarmouth, together with a knife and blank ammunition.
The blank-firing pistol Nishan had bought was a type that could be adapted to fire homemade bullets, like the ones used in the killing. On the day of the murder, he had bought a petrol can in a garage around the corner from the factory and filled it.
Bakuntz had come in at 6:03 on the 21st of December to buy 5 litres of unleaded fuel and a red petrol can. And we knew at that point we were onto something positive.
In October 2003, Bakuntz was arrested on suspicion of murder. The evidence against Nishan was now overwhelming. Bert and his team could link him to the gun, the petrol can, the medical room, and the body. They'd found one of their murderers, but where was the evidence that could tell them who it was they had murdered and why?
I don't know of another case, where you actually find out who the suspect is for the killing and you don't know who the victim is. But that certainly was how it was in this case.
Now in custody, Bakuntz became completely silent and judged psychologically unfit for interview. The police interviewed his wife, Arpine, on suspicion of assisting an offender. She told them that a man had come to stay in the house with her and Bakuntz in the weeks before the murder.
She admitted that there was a man staying at their house, and she only knew him by the name of Sarko, and that her husband would take him out, and he would stay at the factory all night. So all we've got is she couldn't give us any other name apart from he was Sarko, and he'd come across from Europe.
They circulated Sarko's name and description to the police on the continent.
We received a phone call from a Belgian federal police officer who was able to identify Sarko and the fact that he was quite a mean, mafia-style murderer who the Belgian authorities were looking to arrest.
The investigators were shown this video of Sarko. Sarko was also an Armenian suspected to be involved in people smuggling, drugs, and prostitution. He was wanted for murder in Belgium. He'd fled to Norfolk to lay low with Nishan, who'd been one of Sarko's former partners in crime. Witnesses confirmed he'd been staying with Nishan and had been with him at the factory. So, if Sarko was the victim, why had Bakuns wanted to kill him? The answer was that Nishan had turned over a new leaf, and Sarko was the last person he wanted darkening his door.
Nishan Bakuns had developed a normal, I guess, family life in Great Yarmouth, and with children were thriving. Him and his wife were very happy. Sarko turned up, and I believe Sarko upset the balance in Great Yarmouth for Nishan, because Nishan knew how potentially violent Sarko could be.
Sarko was a loose cannon threatening to destroy Bakuns' new life and family.
Arpine was very nervous of Sarko and wouldn't be left alone with him, hence the reason that Nishan started to take Sarko to work with him on night shift, and Sarko slept in the first aid room where the murder ultimately took place.
The only way out Nishan could see was to kill this violent mobster who was threatening to destroy his new life. Securing a conviction can be as much about establishing a motive as it is about securing the critical evidence. And the police certainly now had both for Nishan Bakuns. But there was one last twist left in this tale. There was a final piece of evidence that didn't yet fit the picture. The cigarette lighter used to set fire to the body had unknown DNA on it. Tests revealed it didn't belong to either Nishan or Sarko.
We always believed that there was a potential to have two people involved in this murder investigation.
The victim, although they'd been burnt, was a powerful person, very muscular, quite big, stocky, so somebody wouldn't have been overpowered easy.
The police had no clues to the identity of the mystery accomplice until they spoke again to Bakun's wife, Arpine.
Just as the final interview finished, I can remember it vividly when Arpine said, "Could I just say one more thing?" It wasn't my husband who committed the murder, it was my father.
That put us on a whole new line of inquiry. Now we have to find out exactly where our father lives and prove that he had actually come to England.
Arpine's father, Misha, lived in Holland. The police were soon able to show that he had stayed in a hotel in Great Yarmouth.
We were able to find his fingerprints on the document that he signed when he stayed there on the night of the 19th of December, which is the night before the murder, so we could put him in England.
Finding a motive for why Misha might want Sarko dead wasn't difficult. This was a man trying to force Misha's daughter into prostitution. Dutch police supplied Bert and his team with a sample of Misha's DNA. It matched the DNA on the lighter found at Dead Man's Hollow. The police could now show that Misha had helped Nishan dispose of Sarko's body. The pair stood trial for murder in October 2005. Finally, what had happened the night of the murder was made clear. Nishan Bakunis had arrived at the factory for his night shift as usual. With him was the man he would kill, Sacco.
Nishan would take him to the factory, and there he would normally sleep on the couch in the medical room. Then Sacco, at some stage during the night shift, went off to have his sleep. Misha would have been let into the factory by Nishan.
Police were unable to prove that Misha had taken part in what happened next. But they believed that Nishan Bakunis and one other person entered the medical room where Sacco lay sleeping.
Between the two of them, though, and we knew it had taken more than one, he was killed on the medical couch by both being shot and stabbed.
Bakunis and his accomplice cleaned the medical room and took the contents of the bin with them. Sacco's body was bundled into the boot of Bakunis' car, as was the bin bag containing the memo fragments and the latex glove packet.
They drove to the petrol station and they bought the petrol and then headed for Peterborough. Why they came all this way across, which, you know, I wouldn't have believed somebody would do this with a body in the car, drive from King's Lynn to Peterborough. The chances of being stopped, you know, must have been big, but they did.
When Bakunis and Misha dumped and burned Sacco's body, they thought they were disposing of any evidence that could link them to the crime. But while erasing their steps, they had ensured the critical evidence to convict them would not be lost.
But one thing that undid them really ultimately in the end was in their rush to clear up, they'd used a lot of the paper toweling that we found. That was soaked in water and blood that had been used to clear the medical room up. And they had just dumped that in the bin. They tied that up, took that bin away in its entirety. And when they then drove that body away and dumping it in a field miles and miles away and setting fire to them, what they hadn't realised, I think, at the time, is that actually the very tissue that they'd used to clean the murder scene up was actually preserving a vital piece of evidence that was the letter. And I still think to this day, another 30 seconds, 60 seconds at most, that note would have been completely burnt. The note was the crucial piece of evidence. Without that note, we wouldn't have found the medical room, we wouldn't have found the latex gloves, the medical gloves, we wouldn't have found the tissue paper, we wouldn't have found the blood scene. So we wouldn't have found the murder scene, as simple as that, without that note.
At trial, Nishan Bakunis and Misha accused each other of being the murderer in a cutthroat defence. On October the 27th, 2005, Nishan was convicted of murder. Misha was convicted for assisting an offender. But for the critical evidence, neither would have faced justice.